Hello and welcome to the latest GBCC Q&A session. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Rob Wall and Joe Carr from Work Horizons to talk about redundancies and restructuring and employee obligations. In these challenging times, many businesses will be facing difficult decisions about their workforces, and it's important that employers are fully aware of their obligations and the support available to them during the redundancies and restructuring process. Rob and Joe, it's so good to see you. Thank you for joining me for this session.
Pleasure.
Can I ask you to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your experience in redundancies and restructuring?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Work Horizons is, at its essence, coaching and consultancy practice, where we focus on organisation renewal, which includes redundancies, restructuring and outplacement, but also the positive aspects of life, such as team development, leadership development, and well-being. At its core, we have a website which is a digital outplacement tool. We have around the country about 50 associates and consultants, so we're growing and growing quite quickly. I'm a founder of the organisation. My background is as an executive and career coach, and in the corporate world, I was an HR director in large organisations.
Fantastic.
Oh, sorry. And to introduce myself, I'm Joe Carr. I'm one of the partners at Work Horizons. I'm an HR professional with over 25 years experience across a number of industries: financial services, travel, tourism, insurance, engineering, defence, and have worked in a number of organisational scenarios, from startups through to rapid growth, acquisitions, divestments, and also obviously downsizing as well. I guess my real passion is around talent and knowing and being familiar with the people you've got in your organisation and what they can and could do with some support. I'm also a qualified coach, and most recently, apart from working in the UK, I've got quite a bit of experience of working in Germany as well.
Fascinating, thank you. So to kick off the session, where redundancies are necessary, what are an employer's obligations? Can you sort of walk us through the process, give us a bit of an overview?
Yeah, we try and crank it into a number of segments. It starts with having a real reason for doing it. And that's today, quite obviously, for a lot of companies, that's about cash flow. It's about surviving the next few weeks and months. But even within that, I think organisations can give a broader view. They can think about what life will be like when they come out of it, and perhaps use it to get themselves into a much better situation to deal with the future. They need to have high quality processes. My test is always, what would this look like in an employment court if somebody took us to court claiming unfair dismissal? And if we use that as being the legal minimum, that's a great place to start, but it isn't enough in itself. But it's always the test I go back to. So we need processes which are very clear, which are in place before we get into the exercise, which take the organisation through the formal restructuring, the assessment of the individuals, the consultation, through to a point where they release them. But within that, there are so many steps, so many stages. Too many organisations just jump in, and they'll make decisions like, oh, well, so and so and so and so haven't worked for us for 2 years, therefore we can just dump them. And it is true that if somebody hasn't worked in the organisation for 2 years, they can't claim unfair dismissal, but it isn't true that they can't address the issue through the courts in other ways: wrongful dismissal, discrimination, other issues like that. And there is a level of, I don't know if it's naivety or lack of knowledge or lack of advice and support, but decisions are made which do ultimately come back and caused the organisation a lot of grief, if only for the time and effort and cost of going through the process, which would take the individual through a court case. Consultation is complex. It depends on the size of the organisation. It depends on the number of people who have been made redundant. It depends on whether it's trade union represented. There are a range of variables within it. But most importantly, it's about communicating with the people, and not just those who are at threat of having to leave the organisation. Another test for us is to think about the people who are going to remain there and how they're looking at this whole process and what their motivation will be like afterwards. So the communication, the consultation, and the assessment, which needs to be fair and seen to be fair, which ensures that there's a balance of talent left afterwards. The release is very, very difficult, and too often the line managers aren't prepared for it. We pay a great deal of emphasis for line management preparation. When I previously sat with a line manager who was making someone redundant, who said, "This is hurting me more than it's hurting you." And that was his own script that he'd written. And it was the script he was going to use with a number of people. And I had to coach him a little and say, please don't say that. You know, it just isn't appropriate. Yes, it's a difficult conversation. Yes, you're feeling really bad about all of this, but it's not as bad as losing your job. So that preparation smooths the whole process. It ensures that the assessments are done fairly and equitably. And we take it through to the release, the support that the individuals get afterwards, because what I'm looking for is professional and compassionate. So yes, we're releasing people, it's bad news, but what support can we give? How can we help them through this difficult time? When they go, it's not the end of the process, that's the end of the first stage of the process. Then we get into the tricky bits about rebuilding the team, about motivating the people who are there, who, by the way, are probably going to have to do more because there are fewer of them. And Gallup recently put out a piece of research which said, and this was just before COVID, 70% of the people who work in the organisation are, to use their phrase, actively disengaged. 70% of the people don't want to be there anyway, and now we're giving them more work to do. Now we've said the company's in a difficult situation, and now we've seen them release some of our colleagues and friends. We have to be better at the whole rebuilding process and actually think about the survivor syndrome. Those people who have been retained, how do we manage, how do we lead, how do we actually get them to perform at the level we need for our ongoing success? Because redundancies deal with the issue today. We don't want to be back here again in a short period of time.
Definitely. Thank you. Joe, if I can ask you, so Rob touched on trying to avoid redundancies to begin with.
Yeah.
How can leaders and managers do that and try and avoid redundancies in the first instance?
I think let's be honest here. I mean, organisations today are constantly under permanent cost pressures, and that's in a good year. Now we have COVID, and now we've got Brexit uncertainties. These are adding entirely new pressures on almost a daily basis to businesses, and it's likely to become even greater as we go into 2021. We've got a number of alternative routes, you know, that we could look at. For example, evaluating if it's possible to do job sharing, freezing the hiring process, freezing pay, short time working, eliminating overtime. Those are ways of going that are tried and tested. Then there are some of the more interesting and potentially more rewarding things that could be done. For example, retraining, redeployment, offering sabbaticals and secondments. And for this, those last options, I think an organisation leadership really need to know their people. So they need to know the full picture of the strengths and weaknesses on their bench, as it were, so that they can quickly get an understanding of who potentially could step up or step sideways, for example. And sometimes, you know, you get some great benefits from things you might not normally think of in a good year, if I could say that. We were talking the other day about a project that one of us had worked on recently with a large organization and facing a situation like this. And one of the things that was put forward was seconding someone from the engineering function into procurement, which might not be an obvious thing to do, but the reality of doing that delivered six-figure savings in some of the category spend, which is not to be sniffed at. You know, that kind of comes up to about the equivalent of 7 FTE salaries. So just by being creative, that organization was able to save those roles. But let's be realistic. In order to do this, you really need to understand what you've got within your people. And that's why it's always really, really good to be not only looking at people as they join the organization, what strengths do they bring, but how else they need to be developed. But also throughout the year, what's your talent, your succession looking like, just so that you've got an idea of how much flexibility and give that you've got within the people you've got in your organization. So, you know, I would always say that a great place to start before any of this is really having some kind of insights as to who you've got within your organization so you can leverage that base.
Brilliant, thank you. Thinking about sort of the practicalities of, as you've alluded to, 2020 is a slightly odd year. And obviously we've got the job support scheme and now the extension to the coronavirus job retention scheme, potentially complicating that traditional redundancies process a little. Can employers make redundant staff who are currently on the job support scheme and in the future on the job support scheme and on the coronavirus job retention scheme extension?
Yeah, and the short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is, why would you do it during this whole process? And of course, there is still a cost to the organisation. I mean, that is true, but the cost is relatively minimal, and the impact remains as dramatic on the individuals. It might be that the people who are on furlough are looking for jobs and might come to you and ask if there is a redundancy package, and you can be a little bit flexible around that. But if actually there is no option, you have to do it now, given that you follow process again, because it's not an excuse and won't be dealt with in the courts as a reasonable thing to do, to do it to somebody whilst they're on furlough. You have to do the whole process. Of course, this is now complicated by you doing it through video conference. You're doing it, any consultation through a distant process. The ability to really communicate properly is going to be reduced. And those are the sorts of things that courts will look at, and they'll look for the consistency. One thing that will kill the company's defense for making redundancies is inconsistency. You know, a line manager marking people, everybody as 10 out of 10, and another being more realistic and giving 5s and 6s. It's perhaps that sounds like a simplistic example, but we've seen it. And the organizations need to have a way of ensuring that overall it is fair, it is balanced and equitable, and the right people are retained in the organization.
Definitely. Thank you. I think you've touched on it again there, and both of you have touched on it already a little bit. But what common mistakes or misconceptions, I suppose, do you see coming up again and again in the redundancies process, particularly thinking about the sort of leaders and managers who maybe now, given the current circumstances, might be having to do this for the first times in their careers?
I think the one that leaps to mind instantly is rushing into it. You know, we've got X amount of time to do this because the year end is approaching, etc. Let's try and get it done. I think, first of all, the law will dictate how long the consultation process will last. but it's before you even launch that, I think it's the work that's put into preparing for this is actually going to make it by far a more compassionate and, if you like, safe process to go through. So don't rush into it. You need to prepare well, because otherwise it could lead to, as Rob has mentioned before, potentially disastrous outcomes in the court. Those delivering the process, and I don't just mean your HR folk, it's going to be your line managers, your supervisors. They need to be well trained in what's going to happen. So they do need to be briefed on the bigger picture, and supported through the process, because, you know, we need to make sure these people feel they have the support so that they in turn are representing the organisation well. Because let's remember that each current employee is also a current or a future potential customer. And then there'll be an ambassador after they leave the organisation, and they need to feel as if they were treated fairly and with compassion. And let's remember, it takes years to build up a good reputation within an organisation, and word of mouth can damage it pretty fast these days. Add to that the prevalence of social media and the speed with which things can spread on Glassdoor, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, all of those places. You know, word spreads very quickly, good or bad. So I think taking the time, making sure people are briefed and supported, I think those are the things are common mistakes that people think they can kind of canter straight across the top, and it's best not to.
Proper preparation prevents poor performance.
Yeah.
The 5 Ps.
Definitely. And thinking about that, that preparation, and it's something that you've both touched upon already again, but how can managers prepare for those conversations with their employees about potential redundancies? And is that at all, you know, different, given that with restrictions, these conversations will probably be delivered remotely? But how can they think about pulling together that script that you alluded to for those conversations?
And bearing in mind that these managers might not know whether they are going to be retained or whether they could be victims as well. Excuse me. So that context can influence things. I mean, hopefully they've been reassured, and hopefully they're in a position where they feel adequately secure and confident that they can do this in a professional way. The essence of it, and we keep saying preparation, is making sure that anybody who is in this process, whether it's the assessment or whether it's the conversations or whether it's the consultation, know what their role is. They know the parameters. Yes, we can create scripts, but scripts only take you so far. It would be brilliant if they could find time to actually rehearse the things that we're talking about, and we've used the phrase before, difficult conversations. And these are emotionally very taxing, trying. These may be people who the manager has worked with for years. They may be friends, genuinely friends, apart from the workplace. And they just want to get it done. Very understandably, they just want to get it done. But that, let me use the word coaching, that takes them through, that helps them think through the process, helps them become emotionally stable before they start it, is really, really important. Now, some of these guys will have never had this sort of situation to deal with before. A very small tip is do them early in the morning. Always do the worst things first thing in the morning, because if you don't, they're hanging over you for the whole day, and your own productivity will be really poor. So it's not about rushing it, it's about planning it, it's about putting it in a structured format, having people who are, let me use the word resilient as we do all the while, but they know what they're going to do, and they know how they're going to do it. Remembering also that it's not just the people that they're talking, it's not the people who are going that they're talking to, it's the people who are going and those who are staying. And a common mistake is when they're talking to people who are staying within the organisation, is to let their guard down and say things they shouldn't say to people who are friends of the victims, the casualties of all of this. So that discipline needs to be maintained. And they shouldn't be saying things like, well, Fred, good news, you've got a job. You should be grateful. Now I expect you to work even longer hours. It undermines everything. And it's that lack of thoughtfulness, perhaps naivety, perhaps arrogance. You know, it's my business, I'll do what I want, which I've certainly had those conversations with people. And that's why I use this thing about the courts, is that, you know, that's the test. Always consider what it will look like in a court. You know, it can be more or less two questions. One of which is, did you know you were going? And the second is, how much do you want me to pay you because I've done this so badly?
Definitely a difficult conversation to prepare for, but worth thinking about extensively in advance. So sort of thinking about that, how can managers who are having to make redundancies support those staff who are having to leave the business in finding new employment or training?
Well, before we get to that point, I think I'd pick up on and continue on the theme that Rob just mentioned. I think, make no mistake, and certainly in my experience, it doesn't matter how small or large the organisation is, or the number of people impacted, or whether it's unionised or non-unionised. Redundancy consultation is stressful for everyone. And it doesn't matter how many times you do it throughout your career, there's always going to be something new or unexpected. As we said earlier, perhaps the law has changed, or I think people often assume that those people they're going to be working with, all they'll be worried about is how much am I going to get? And actually, every individual who's in the consultation will have a different set of priorities. So I guess I would say prepare to be surprised at how people react and when they react, because everyone has a differing speed of reaction. And you know, I've been in meetings where people, you know, who will sit there very dispassionately, completely, yes, Joe, I completely understand we're in a difficult situation. It's absolutely fine. No, I understand there was no way around this, etc. No, you've made it very, very clear. And we'll leave the meeting, and then you think, gosh, that went well. Then actually within a week they're in a really different place. They're angry, or they're completely disengaged, or indeed some people may find it actually affects them physically in terms of the well-being, and you don't see them again. So it's never good to kind of, just because someone looks okay on that day, to assume that that's how they're going to be throughout the whole process. I think we'll come on to some of the things we can help them with later on, but I guess I would reiterate what Rob said earlier, and that's prepare. Be detailed, understand what you're going to say and who you're going to say it to. And there was a point that you made, I think, Rob, in terms of rehearsing. And I know it sounds stupid, but actually, if you can get some time in to do that with your managers beforehand, just to actually go through it in a kind of role play, or even at home on your own in a mirror situation, it just gives you the sense of a confidence in what you're delivering, even though it's a hard conversation to have. And also that then goes into the conversation, and it will feel better for the person at the other end, not rushing it, delivering more confidence and delivering a greater sense of authenticity. I think that's hugely important to this. And also the person actually delivering the message, they need to give themselves time between doing it, and acknowledge how they're feeling as well, because it isn't nice to go through that feeling of the night before the morning that's to come, knowing exactly what you're going to be saying to people you've been working with a long or short time, whatever your relationship. It's a hell of a weight to carry. So I think supporting people through that is really, really important.
One of the tips I would give is, if it's possible, have 2 meetings with the individual. It's the way I've always prepared to go. The first is you give them the bad news. You may well give them a document which outlines it all. But the second meeting is where you actually talk about the implications and ramifications of it and the support and anything else. When people are hearing bad news, they stop listening. So it's always better if they have somebody with them, even if it's, you know, just a work colleague who's there, possibly as a witness, possibly as a second pair of ears, but there to give them emotional support. But don't think that because you've said some words to the individual that they're listening, that they're actually taking them on board. It's very, very difficult. And it's, let me not overstate it, but it's the same principle as when somebody's being given bad news about their health. The doctors rarely do it on their own. They have somebody with them, and they will always want the individual to have somebody to support. And it's the other person usually who remembers what was actually said about what happens next.
Thanks, Rob. That's really, really helpful. So thinking about sort of moving on from, so you have those two conversations with the staff that are losing their jobs. From there, how can, as an employer, you help them to find new employment and training?
Some larger organisations have in-house support. I created a company called Skills Network within Rover Group nearly 30 years ago to help, because Rover Group was very good at making people redundant. And then hiring a lot of people almost immediately afterwards, but that's a sort of vagary of how life was then. So some organisations have got in-house support. Many need to buy in outplacement. Outplacement is just that mechanism which takes the individual and gets them to think through processes. What sort of job do I want? Can I get a job which would be even better than one I just had? What are my requirements financially, location, shifts, all the variables that go with it? Then the processes of job hunt, writing a CV, which is there are books a legion on the subject, all of which disagree with one another. And of course, there's no simple answer to what does a good CV look like. Where are there vacancies? What about considering self-employment? How do I prepare for interviews? The whole gamut, through to a point where, how do I deal with rejection? How do I deal with an offer? And then perhaps importantly, now I've got a job, how am I going to survive and thrive now I'm in it? And those actually are the main elements of the Work Horizons website. So ours is a digital outplacement process, which the main benefit is that it's 24/7. The individual, whatever time of night or day, can go online and do something proactive towards resolving the problem, which is, I've lost my job. We all know that 4 a.m. is the terrible time. We wake up, we've had a good sleep, the likelihood of going back to sleep is remote, and we're worried. And at that time, there's a spiral. Oh, I'm losing my job. I might lose my house. I might lose my family. And these aren't necessarily rational thoughts, but it's where our mind takes us. And there's a real value to us, any of us, being able to say, hang on a minute, stop, I'll just go and do something. I'll review my CV. I'll look at the vacancies that have come up overnight. Something very specific. If you've got a career coach, and they are great, most of them, they will be able to give brilliant support during the day. And we have career coaches who support people in addition to the digital side. Of course we do. But you can't ring them at 4 a.m. and it's not there all the while. So we have created something which is a career coach online, which will supplement any other support the individuals are getting. But those people are faced with what, in the immediacy of redundancy, may well feel like an insurmountable task. How, I'm 43. How am I going to get another job? I'm not 43, by the way. And they just build and build and build in the individual's mind. And we can help them to bring back a sense of reality, to be rational, and to think about what they really could do. And so many stories of people who say, oh, being made redundant was the best thing that ever happened to me. Didn't feel like it at the time, but actually it's turned out brilliantly.
Absolutely. I think, as you say, that holistic support and making sure that you've got support for you and someone to talk to, and someone to emotionally be there for you throughout the whole process, but also having something to do, having a practical resource, and to sort of bring you back to reality a little bit in those moments where maybe you're panicking and you're on your own. I can definitely relate to that 4 a.m. panic point. So definitely appreciate that. So sort of thinking about, so that's support for those who are leaving the organisation. How can leaders and managers approach rebuilding engagement and trust with those remaining staff? You mentioned sort of survivors earlier, but following redundancies and restructuring, how do you rebuild that trust and that engagement in your staff?
Yeah, just to pick up on something Rob said earlier, it's just important to acknowledge what's happened. Okay, so you've finished what you needed to do, but the reality is that's just another step in something that's a much bigger plan in terms of the organization. So where are we going next? And it's important also to acknowledge that people have lost friends and colleagues. Yes, of course, they can still see them outside of work, but there may also be an element of what you call survivor's guilt. How is it that I'm still here? Why did they get made redundant? Do they hate me now? And those sort of awful kind of soul-searching questions that people actually do go through. And there might actually be some anger towards the leadership. You got us in this position. What are you going to do next? That's also normal as well. And I think at that point, making sure you're building the skills of the managers that you've got with you is really essential to the success of how you move into the next step. I mean, it could be that a short burst of one-to-one or even group coaching for those managers, supervisors, people leaders, whatever you want to call them, will help them prepare for some of the tricky and emotional conversations that they might be coming up in the coming weeks as you move away from the redundancy program. That is going to do two things. Firstly, it's going to build their skills as a leader, which you would want to do anyway. But secondly, it makes sure that the conversations they have are authentic, are well thought through, aren't reactionary. And as Rob mentioned earlier, that you're not mentioning that, oh, lucky you, you're still here, I'm going to crack the whip kind of scenario, ha, 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 I'm only joking. That's not funny. So you want to avoid those kind of things. So I think it is important to look at how your supervisors, leaders, people, team leaders, etc., are communicating and support them to up their game in that respect. It's not normal, however, to just move on as if it didn't happen. Tempting though it may be to think if you just move on from it, we can quickly forget about it and get into the new normal. It's redundancy for those who experience it, whether they're actually impacted by losing their job or remaining behind. It actually is like a form of grief. You're losing something. Could be an income, could be self-esteem, could be a colleague, could be trust in the organization temporarily. So you have to be able to allow some form of grieving to let it heal. So I think it's really important to acknowledge it in one-to-ones with people and in team meetings to talk about it. And obviously we mentioned before, there's still work to be done. So how are those tasks going to be delivered? And whilst again it's tempting, I'm the manager, I've got all of the answers, the reality is probably by involving those people that are still in the teams, the left behinds, as to how you can do that moving forward, it'll allow those people to kind of become more engaged in it, more owning of what they need to do, and to feel as if they're contributing to their own, if you like, destiny in a way, if you like, so to speak. So I guess the next thing after that is, so what's the plan? What's next? As I mentioned when I started on this section, this was only part of something we've had to go through this redundancy process in order to achieve cost savings. Okay, we've done that. There's a reason for that. So what's got to be done differently? How do we communicate that to people so that they know we're moving in the right direction? They probably want to know, is this the part, stage one of further redundancies? How will we know if that's going to happen? So I think communication and a plan is really critical in that. And I think the final point I would just say as an observation is, it's good to remember the small but really significant things that may have been lost in the process. So maybe in the team we lost someone who used to bake cake every Friday, or they organised the outings to the dogs or to the pub or whatever it was, or they were the charity point person, or whenever there was like a World Cup of something, they would organise us all into teams and have draws and all that sort of stuff. When you lose stuff like that, you lose the fabric of the family in a way, and it's important that we need to acknowledge that people will still expect to see those things happening. Who's going to do it? You don't want to lose those fun human activities that create new memories and shared experience and bring the team together again. So I think there's a lot in here about acknowledging what's been lost, acknowledging what's yet to be done, but being really, really clear about how well we're doing against the plan so people can feel confident that they're heading in the right direction.
Absolutely, and I think that's a very important observation about the sort of almost the informal aspects of team.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
I mean, you talk about people and why do they go to work, and the vast majority of people's first response is, it's the people I work with. So when we're going through this destabilization thing, when we get to the other side, keep that in mind, because you've got to build on that again.
Absolutely. Well, that's obviously a bit of a rush through the whole redundancies and restructuring process, and I'm sure just the tip of the iceberg of your advice from all your experience between the two of you. How can people, I know you referenced your website earlier, Rob, where is your website? Do you want to just let people know how to access it?
Yeah, it's workhorizons.com, and on there, for example, people can access a free paper on the value of outplacement, just using that one. But there's a mountain of information which is available to everyone. All of our contact details are there. We are sadly experts in redundancy. You know, it's not the greatest epitaph that you'd want for yourself, but professional, compassionate, and recognizing, that's one bit. And the really important bit, as Joe's just been describing, is the future. Otherwise, what are we doing this for? It has to be because we believe that there's a future. Maybe the teams get mixed up and we've got to do a lot of team building around all of that, bring people together. We might need to do a whole range of better communication. But the people who stay want to know that there's a future, they have a future, and that the work is worthwhile. We can help with that, of course we can. We'd be delighted to. The information's on the website, and people can just, my phone number's on there, people can just give me a ring. Be delighted to talk with anyone.
Fantastic, thank you ever so much. That will be a really helpful resource, I'm sure, for anyone watching, and a great way to finish. So thank you, Rob, and thank you, Joe, for your time this morning.
You're welcome. Absolute It's a pleasure.
Thank you.